Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be looking at the dwarves, their legendary lords, their faction effects, lord effects, and starting armies, and I'll be ranking them from difficulty from easiest to hardest for new players. Please like and or subscribe if you enjoy the video. Feel free to leave a comment, I'll reply to any that are left, and thank you very much to everyone who's already subscribed. Without further ado, let's get into the video. So, when looking at the dwarves, we start here with Thorgrim, with Karak. Now he starts over here, relatively easy start position, can expand in 4 different directions with relative ease, Badlands beneath him with the old world above him. It's a very nice centralised starting position. Also near other Dwarf Faction to confederate, there are ones along here, ones up here and down here. Army-wise, his army is pretty decent. Standard Dwarf Warriors, decent axe infantry, nothing too special there. Hammerers, none of them used to be very good, but actually are okay now because they receive their buff. They have a lot more health now, and they also have magical attacks, as you can see there, which means they can deal with a lot of units that may have high physical resistance. Miners, these are okay, they're quite good in sieges, and they're okay as an early game damage dealing unit, but they're not amazing. The blasting charges variant is a lot better. Quarrelers, a decent crossbow unit, they also are not bad in melee, they're quite tanky, decent range, decent ammo. They'll do quite well for you in the early game, especially against unarmoured enemies like vampires and low-tier empire units. Dwarf warriors with great weapons, these are excellent. Great axe infantry, armour piercing, they do a lot of damage, they're very tanky, high leadership like all dwarf units. Solid starting unit, gyro bomber. This is a pretty decent unit for shooting down infantry. You have 11 bombs to drop as well if we go down here and look at them, and they can, if you drop a lot of them on blobs of units, this thing can rack up a lot of kills. It's got a lot of ammo and a decent missile strength. You'll get some good kills with this thing. And then Longbeards, these are a really nice unit. They help keep leadership up even when your lord dies with their old Grumbler perk. And they're pretty tanky and pretty good in melee, especially at holding the line. They don't do a lot of damage, but they're good at holding. Wise, Karak has a few different effects, starting with the chance to receive additional random rewards for every grudge resolved. This is pretty good. You'll be resolving a lot of grudges, from minor quest ones to big ones you might get to take provinces or to kill certain lords. And this just means you get more rewards. Maybe it's more public order or a reduced recruitment cost, or maybe it's just more money. It's always very nice to have. It gives him a little bit of flavour, but not tons. Plus 20 diplomatic relations with dwarves, very, very nice. You'll be speaking to dwarves a lot. You want to confederate them quickly, especially the ones that are around you. This makes it a lot easier. You have a flat 20 buff there. Gets making early game treaties even easier. You don't have to pay them to get them to like you. The buffs to hammerers and longbeards here, quite nice. So hammerers get a minus 15% upkeep and recruit rank plus 3. Hammerers are pretty decent. This means that your army will be cheaper at the start of the game, and plus 3 recruitment means they'll start more strong than they would originally. Minus 50% upkeep for longbeards, also quite nice. They're quite a nice tank unit. I sometimes recruit them, so this is a nice bonus to have. And commandments have more powerful effects. This means you can reduce corruption or increase growth at a more exponential rate, which is really nice to have. It's a really solid faction effect. Lord-wise, his abilities are a little dull, but they're not awful. They mainly buff hammerers with 15% physical resistance on top of their already quite high, makes them very, very tanky, and they get this guardian, which gives everyone around them 15% physical resistance as well, which is also really nice, and gives hammerers a real tanky frontline style of a unit. He also gets this shite here, leadership aura size plus 75%, really quite pointless. I suppose it's slightly better with dwarves, purely because they will last longer, so their lord can give them more of a leadership buff, but they don't need it anyway, and leadership aura, as I've always said, is just a shite mechanic, and so this isn't a big buff to really concern yourself with. He himself is pretty decent in combat, he's pretty good at killing stuff, he's very tanky as a lord, has a few cool items, he's fairly good, he's better on the campaign map than in battle I think, but that doesn't stop him being fun. Next up is Ungrim with Karak. He starts just north of Thorgrim, actually up here, close to the vampires and other greenskin factions. Compared to Thorgrim, his start's quite hard, but it's not hard by any means really. It's not helped by his starting army, which although quite fun, is not that good. It's Slayers. These are a decent anti-large unit with absolutely no armour, so they will get absolutely destroyed by any ranged units you fight, and they don't do overly well in melee against other infantry, but against large units they will bring them down quite quickly. And if you fight him, he'll often just spam these in quite an entertaining fashion. Quarrelers with great weapons, pretty cool. They are just quarrelers, but they're also good in melee, and this means that you can have them use all their ammo and then they can go into battle and actually perform, unlike a lot of other ranged units. So these are a nice unit to have. Iron Drakes with Trollhammer torpedoes. These are an interesting variant of Iron Drake. So normal Iron Drakes are flamethrower infantry. This variant gets torpedoes that they fire. It's a very slow firer, and they don't have a lot of ammunition, but they do a lot of damage to large targets. They're good against massive flyers, against giants, etc. They're quite fun. I don't find them that good. but they are quite a fun unit to start with. Thunderers, these are a really good unit. This is his best unit he starts with. These are very good ranged gun infantry, armour piercing, they're good in melee, they're tanky, they're not going to get destroyed by a cavalry charge, they've got good ammo and good range, very solid unit. And then standard dwarf warriors, same as Thorgrim. Faction wise, it's mainly buffs to slayers, minus 75% construction cost and 50% recruitment cost for slayer buildings and units respectively. The building reduction cost is really nice because this means anywhere you go you can essentially just build a slayer building for next to nothing, so you can recruit them up. And there are more than one type of slayers. There's this variant and there's a variant with bigger weapons that does more damage. That is nice, and the recruitment minus 50% cost means you can get them much easier in all your armies if you want to have some. Having 3 or 4 is never a bad thing. He also gives 10% speed to the dwarves, which, considering that 90% of their units are infantry, is actually really nice, and considering their normal slow speed anyway, it's quite a nice buff, especially to already relatively speedy dwarf units like slayers. Lord-wise, it's mainly slayer buffs as well. 25% upkeep reduction. Pretty standard, it's not bad, although I wouldn't recommend having more than 4 or 5, so this is never going to be incredible for doomstacking or anything, but it's not a bad thing to have, especially in the early game. Melee attack plus 5, not a big thing. They already start off with a melee attack 38, so this only bumps it up a little bit. It makes it slightly more likely they're going to hit things, so it's not a bad thing. They also get this ability, which is actually really good, Journey's End in his army, giving them their unit cap, which is 80. They cannot go beneath it while their hit points remain above 75%. So if they're fighting and they lose like 20% of their health, not one of the units will die, which also makes it really nice for going into battles after you've taken some damage. It's good in auto-resolves, and it's also really nice because it means you'll be doing more damage for a longer period of time. He himself is one of the better Dwarf Lords in combat. He's very good at dealing with large lords and large monsters. He's a big anti-large killer. Pretty solid lord. Next up, we have Belegar with Clan Angrand. He starts over here, where he started before, near Athelloren and Bretonia and Skaven and stuff around here. Is it an easy start? No, it's one of the hardest starts in the game, and it's because of his faction effects that I'll get onto in a moment. But his starting army, also quite shockingly bad, to be honest. Dwarf warriors and miners, boring. Hammerers, as I said earlier, pretty decent unit, and to start with them is nice, but they're not a difficult unit to get really, and they're not that exciting to start with. Rangers, these are a decent ranged unit. They've not got much ammo, but they've got a good range, they've got stalk, they're quite speedy. Well, for a dwarf, as it says, they're not going to outrun any cavalry, but they might outrun, some other ranged units. And they've got okay armour. These are not great, I would not recruit them, but they're okay. Their vanguard deployment makes them a little bit more situational. However, the faction effect is why I think he really sucks, and why his campaign's really hard. Plus 50% upkeep on all armies until Carrick 8 Peaks is recaptured. Now, to just point out, Carrick 8 Peaks is over here. It's a long way to go through a lot of land, and you either have to abandon this place in order to get there really early on, in which case you either get there and you win, or your campaign's over, or you have to slowly expand that way, but only with 1 or 2 armies, because you have to pay 50% more than any other faction for your armies. And this buff, I just think, is too much. It's such a big detriment to dwarves, especially because their armies are already quite expensive, that it just doesn't benefit him, because when he gets there he gets his unique building chain, but I don't think it makes up for the upkeep that he has to get unless he rushes there at the start, which is also really difficult, and I would not recommend doing. He's offset, apparently, by starting with these Clan Angrand Ancestor heroes that I don't really rate. They're quite cool, they are spectral, which means they don't take really any physical damage, they range in their specialties, one of them can cast rune magic, one of them's good against large, but it doesn't mean they're good, and they're certainly not as good as having another army, which is what this essentially locks you out of having. Plus 2 leadership when laying siege or encircling, utterly shit. Dwarves do not need plus 10 leadership, and let's be honest, if you are in leadership laying siege or encircling, the likelihood is you've already got the advantage, so you don't need that either. Lord-wise, he has slightly better abilities than faction-wise. He gets his Mighty Oathstone ability, makes his entire front line really, really tanky. Expert charge defense, melee defense plus 24, they're not going anywhere. Pretty cool. Pretty good for holding a front line. Another leadership buff, I think once again pointless, but you are more likely to fight greenskins, ogres and Skaven than you are to need it when laying siege, and so this is not a bad thing to have built in. And vanguard deployment during underway battles, I wish this was during all battles, like with Vlad, but it doesn't stop it being useful. It's just you won't be fighting that many underway battles. I also don't really understand why this isn't a faction effect, because it does affect every single army, not just his. Next up, we have Grombrindal, first Dwarf Lord to have been moved. He is now over here, near Nagarond, near Kartep, Sisters, Taurox, etc. Pretty difficult start he's got now. He does make up for it though, with having a really good starting army. Miners, pretty standard. Hammerers, good magical damage as I've already said. Quarrelers, once again, decent ranged unit. Dwarf Warriors, pretty standard. Thunderers, as I said earlier, excellent missile unit. any dwarf will be happy to have them, and I'd recommend recruiting them as well, but they're good to start with. Gyrostopter Brimstone Gun. So unlike Thorgrim's one, this is the anti-large variant. I think this version is better. It still has the bombs built in, as you can see here. They are less of them, but they do a lot more damage. They do have a bigger circle as well, so I prefer this version of the bomb as well, but I also think the missiles do more because they only fire a certain amount anyway, and firing against large targets is more beneficial, especially when they're anti-large missile attacks. He also has normal Iron Drakes. These are better than the Trollhammer Torpedo variant, but they're still not great. Flamethrowers, not much ammo, not much range, not very fast. Can't shoot over allies, but if you get them into a flanking position, they will demolish armoured or unarmoured units by just melting them. And so I think they're really fun. I usually recruit a couple because they're fun. Doesn't mean they're good though, but you can make them work if you micromanage them quite well. Faction-wise, his faction effects are fairly interesting, but not that special. Plus 6% evasion chance when using the underway. This is actually better than it sounds, purely because there's a lot of mountains here, so he'll be using the underway a lot to get around. And it just means that if you're trying to run away from, say, Malekith, you're 60% more likely to do it, so that's pretty juicy. 20% weapon strength when fighting against elves. Pretty good for everything in every army, considering that almost all of this continent is mainly elves, and obviously you have Ulthuan here with loads of elves, and there are elves elsewhere in the world. So this makes it pretty juicy for dealing with any other elf factions, because you'll just be 20% more weapon strength across every single unit. It also has this Ancestor God ability here, where he can call upon their power. This is a cool mechanic. It's every 10 or 20 turns. He'll get a choice. He can buff his army, he can buff him, he can buff his growth, recruitment cost, or he can buff his corruption and public order and stuff. Pretty solid. It makes him slightly more interesting, but I don't think it happens enough to make it an interesting mechanic. I just felt it was like a little bit of a buff that you get anyway. But it did make our campaign slightly easier, although I always did just go with the army buff ones because I thought they were the most useful. Lord-wise, pretty interesting effects. Not that useful though. Melee defense plus 10 for Quarrelers and Iron Drakes. Quarrelers, Iron Drakes. They don't need it. To be honest, if they're getting bogged down anyway, they're going to get fucked, especially Iron Drakes. But it makes them last slightly longer. But the thing is, they're not going to do much damage in melee, so I don't find this as useful as maybe applying it to something like Hammerers. Plus 50% reinforcement range. This is his best ability because it means that he can stand a little bit further away and reinforce, so he can actually use his underway or force march to get close enough to reinforce without having to get right next to the enemy, which is quite a useful way of getting reinforcements. Although sometimes they do just turn around and rush at you, and the other army isn't in reinforcement range. Leadership plus 10. This is very boring and unnecessary. He has a good aura anyway. Dwarves have excellent leadership. It's not that big. I never found it useful when I played as him, but you might get some use out of it on very, very high difficulties. He himself is quite good in combat. He gets a lot of kills, especially against blobs of enemies, and his items are pretty fun as well. Finally, we have Thorek of Ironbrow's expedition, who starts over here in the desert, near a bunch of factions. There's a load of factions that start down here, and this means that he'll have a very big variety of factions to fight, which makes his campaign slightly more varied than maybe some of the other dwarf ones. His starting army is pretty crap, but not awful. I just think it's really boring, to be honest. He gets Iron Breakers, which are an interesting, very tanky unit with a small ranged weapon, a bit like miners with blasting charges, that are quite good against armoured enemies. They're good at holding the line. They're not that interesting though. Dwarf Warriors, pretty standard. Longbows are great weapons, same as Thorgrim. Pretty good damage dealing unit. Quarrelers, standard, bit dull. Grudgebearers, these are a decent early game catapult unit. They're actually very accurate. They've got a good range, good ammo, good missile strength. They can be buffed by engineers. They are a solid unit. And having 2 or 3 in your army is always nice to have up to about turn 50. He starts with 1, makes it a lot easier against blobs, especially against big swarm factions. His faction effects are actually fairly good. Oath gold from buildings, plus 100%. Gets double any oath gold you might get from buildings. You don't get tons from buildings, but this makes it slightly more economical. This one's nice. Oath gold cost for crafting runes minus 50%. Runes are really good. They do a whole range of things, from making your melee attacks do magical damage, to making your missiles become like hell cannons where they seek the enemy out. And this makes it 50% easier to craft these runes and use them on your units. Very nice. He also gives these buffs to runesmiths. Plus 5 recruit rank. This means they can come in and get their speed rune and their damage rune very quickly and go into battle without being pointless. And minus 25% upkeep means you can have one in every army and actually use them. And runes magic is actually pretty good because it doesn't rely on winds of magic. I think it's quite good, if a little underpowered, and so it's quite nice to be able to have these in your army. Lord wise, the Lord effects are boring apart from the third one. Plus 10 armour. His army is more tanky, but I don't personally like just sitting there and just tanking a load of damage. I think it's quite dull, and because he's not a magic-based faction anyway, he's not really casting like Wind of Death down them, so it's a bit dull. But it is a nice defensive buff, especially at high difficulties. This one is bizarre. Armour piercing weapon damage +3. I don't understand why this exists. It's such a minimal damage buff, it's not going to do very much. It means everything in your army has armour piercing damage, but it's only +3, and it's not going to do a lot when fighting as properly armour piercing targets or really thickly armoured targets. It's a bit of a weird buff, and I don't personally see its benefit. I think he should have something else. This is nice though, 15% real time reduction for bolt thrower, grudge thrower and quarrelers units. Obviously quarrelers are here, grudge throwers are there. Bolt throwers are the anti-large variant of these. They are ballistas, similar range, similar ammo, similar missile strength, but they do anti-large damage and they fire a bolt rather than a rock. This just makes them fire 50% faster. Very nice for kind of beating other units' artillery, especially when you get the reload time reduction from the dwarf tech tree as well. He himself is quite good in combat. He's a good user of rune magic. He has some cool items. He's okay in melee. Relatively fun lord. So when it comes to ranking them, I would recommend for new players to start with either with Thorgrim, because of his decent faction lord effects, starting army and pretty safe starting position, or with Ungrim. For similar reasons, he's slightly harder if you like with a lord that does a bit more in battle, with a slightly weaker starting army. He's more your kind of guy. Slayers are a fun unit, I like these, and he's got a slightly more challenging but still quite simple start. Then I would recommend Thorek. He's got a nice varied start, decent starting army, and his rune magic effects mean that you can have a little bit more of a different playstyle to when you might play with other dwarf lords. Then Grombrindal, although he is hard, his starting army is really fun. His faction and lord effects are relatively interesting if a little dull, and he has a lot of expansion room up here. His underway is really useful, and you can have a lot of kind of varied battles with some quite tough foes and get some good rewards quite early on with him. And then, if you are desperate, play as Belegar. Belegar suffers at the moment. I think this faction effect alone makes him just too weak. His starting army is boring, the ancestor heroes are quite dull, and this means that you just have less armies. It is just playing a less fun campaign. If you confederate him, he's okay, he's quite fun, maybe, in some forms of combat being quite tanky, but do not play him. Even just trying to go for Caracate piece is not that enjoyable with him because of this upkeep reduction. I don't think that the reward you get is worth having, essentially, less armies. It is a fun cap, and I don't think he is fun or easy at all. So, that concludes the video on the dwarves, their lords, their starting armies, and then my ranking. Please like and or subscribe if you enjoyed the video. I hope you enjoyed it at least to some extent, and feel free to leave a comment or reply to any that are left. Big thank you to everyone who's already subscribed, it means the world to me. Thank you for watching, and have a great day, folks.